2, 1. Good evening, everyone, and happy holidays. Merry Christmas, happy Hanukkah. This is Douglas Trapasso, author of Still Searching for My First Growth. We've got a great My First Growth interview today. If you are at all interested in wine and you're studying for one of those Sommelier tests here in Chicago, you probably know my guest, Serafin Alvarado. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Correct.
Okay, from Southern Wine and Spirits. And you've been doing a lot of seminars lately. You were at Chicago Gourmet a couple months ago.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you've been doing a few things at various Marianos, and we just finished one up tonight at the Marianos in Ravenswood, which just opened up. So thank you for the invite to come tonight.
Glad to have you with us, yeah.
We had a really awesome hour with Serafin, all about wine and cheese pairing. It could really be extended to just wine and food pairing in general. So if you missed it, we're going to hit some of the highlights right now. So one of the things that you mentioned right away, what makes a great pairing is when you mentioned a metaphor like 1 + 1 = 10. So
Yeah,
that's talk about what you meant by that?
That was just the synergy component. So the whole idea of the extraordinary pairing is when you add one component, one dish aspect itself, you add the wine aspect itself, and then it elevates. Mm-hmm. Each other become better as a result of that companionship. So I use the analogy as a marriage. When you find that perfect other, you know, mm-hmm. that what it does, it doesn't diminish you, what it does, it elevates. It brings what you already have and makes you even greater and better. Mm-hmm. And it's an experience. It's something, one of those things that doesn't happen on a regular basis, but when it happens, it gets your attention.
Okay.
And we had kind of those moments here today.
We definitely had a few of those. What are some times that you've experienced that yourself in your career?
Oh, many times. I think that for me, one of my greatest experiences was scallops with a Riesling from Trimbach, 1976 vintage.
Okay. Yeah. The wine, not the scallops, I hope.
Well, no, it's actually nicely done. It was a close-end hewn Trimbach.
Okay.
Scallops, and it just really elevated. I mean, it brought all the intrinsic sweetness, inherent sweetness of the scallops with the delicate qualities of the Riesling at that time, and I thought, this is what wine and food pairing is all about.
Okay. You mentioned something about understanding the key components of both your food and the wine.
Yes.
So, how complicated do you have to get in that? Do you have to focus on like more than 1 or 2 major components of each, or is it something that you kind of have to consider in its totality?
I think it's a matter of what is the highlight.
Okay.
And what is the outstanding component within the dish? What is the outstanding component within the wine? So today, for example, from the cheese perspective, the outstanding component was the fat aspect of it. In some instances, for example, in the goat cheese, there was an acidic element that came into play. But mostly it was about fat and salt. Mm-hmm. So those are the outstanding elements of it. So when you look into the wine, we went through each wine, and there were certain wines that were more acidic, kind of in the champagne realm, or in the Sauvignon Blanc quality. There were wines that had a little bit tannin component, certain red wines that we taste today. And there were other wines, like for example, the port, that brought a little bit more of that richness, alcohol, body, weight, and sugar and sweetness. So all that considered, and using the primary criteria of body, right? In terms of matching weight with weight, then it's a starting point in relation to establish a pairing.
Okay. One of the things I thought was so cool about this is that there were about a dozen of us here tonight. So we had 4 different wines and 4 different cheeses, and it was really revealing to me just how many both good and bad combos can be made out of not a really big collection of anything. So if you got the right 4 wines and the right 4 cheeses, you could really compare and make a lot of good comparisons.
We try to pick cheeses that were representative of the primary categories, within that goat cheese category, within that creamy brie type of cheese, within that hard cheese, that manchego that we had, and within that blue vein cheese. So they represent kind of the gamut, general. I mean, we can break this down a little bit more detail, but kind of represent the umbrella gamut in terms of wine, in terms of cheeses. And with wine, we try to kind of represent the same thing. We went with sparkling wine, champagne, with medium-bodied version of a white wine with some wine, to a red wine, mild tannic, to the port.
Right.
Fortified wine.
And you know, it's funny because I don't know quite how to say this, but sometimes it's hard to put into words. But when you're tasting it, you just feel that something is right, or something is just absolutely not right.
Or not right.
I mean, we had some great sound bites from the studio audience tonight. We have something here. I have something note here. Port kill debris. So I'm guessing that's pretty common.
Yeah. I mean, there's a subjective component, right? Obviously,
Sure.
and we saw today the difference of opinions in relation to the pairings. I think something that to understand here is that probably came out today is that for every pairing, there's a red wine, there's a white wine possibility, and it more depends on your likes and dislikes.
Sure.
But the options are out there, and I think it's all about experimentation. You know, like we did today. Today was really experimentation exercise. There was nothing written. There was no script in terms of what the result should be or not be. It was a matter of let's have some cheeses on the table. Let's open some wines and let's see what happens.
Sure. I imagine when you do these little seminars that you're always a little surprised, at least at some point.
Oh yeah, and that's the beauty of it. There's an element of surprise, and regardless, like I said earlier, there's a win-win in the process because you learn what works for you, you learn what doesn't work for you.
Sure.
So regardless, there's an educational aspect to this, and I think that's a takeaway there.
Sure. Okay. With the caveat that there are like individual palettes, like every palette's a fingerprint, but there's certain things that you can't imagine working. You mentioned a couple of no-nos. Can you repeat those for our blog audience here?
It doesn't necessarily apply to what we did today here, but in general, from a wine food tasting perspective, pairing perspective, I had a question that what are the absolute no-nos? And regardless of, like you said, Douglas, individual palates, and I think there are certain things that should always be avoided. And one of this, which is generally, there's a consensus in relation to high tannic wines. I think about like a Cabernet Sauvignon, with typically high tannins, Nebbiolo, for example, Pinot Barolo. Think about that in relation to, let's say, a very oily type of fish.
Okay.
Mackerel, sardines, that category. What it really does, it really accentuates a metallic quality character. The palate is very, 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 extremely unpleasant. So that is something to avoid. And the other one that is also kind of very well known is when you have a dish that's really hot in relation to spice, heat component, avoid high alcohol wines.
Okay.
So anything that is, think about hot New World Cabernets, Australian Shiraz, Malbecs, things that in itself intrinsically is going to have an elevated level of alcohol. If you put it with something that's very spicy, what it does is kind of creates that fire and gasoline kind of an analogy principle where it just magnifies the heat.
Okay. Well, I'm going to close now with a question. This really didn't come up in this seminar, but a lot of us are going to be entertaining the next few weeks for Christmas, Hanukkah, New Year's. Are there certain wines that are safer bets that are a little bit more amenable to a variety of dishes, of sides than others?
There's what is called food-friendly wines, and obviously you got your Cabs, you got all these Chardonnay, for example. But these wines can be a little bit polarizing depending on the circumstances, the context. And like you said, there are certain wines that tend to be a little bit more easy regardless of the situation. And the conditions are, in general, are low alcohol wines. So wines that are not in that realm of 14.5% of alcohol, something that's within that 12.5, 13% of alcohol, they tend to be much more flexible with different wine and food preparations. Wines that tend to lean towards higher acidity. So think about champagne, sparkling wine, white wines, Barino, Riesling, for example. Chablis. These are wines that also have a fruit compatibility because the acidity, for me, is the paramount aspect in terms of making wine through bridges having to occur. In some instances, if there's a little bit of residual sugar, I know that sometimes people are fearful and paranoid about residual sugar, but that little hint of residual sugar kind of also helps bring certain dishes together.
Okay.
And lack of oak.
Lack of oak.
Yeah, the absence of oak. So if there are wines that has the absence of aging the wine in oak barrels, and particularly use of new oak, there could be some oak influence, but it helps us round the wine, mill the wine, and soften the wine, and enhance the wine. But when we talk about new oak, there's a certain quality characteristics that could be competing flavor-wise in certain dishes. So think about that. Lower alcohol, higher acidity, maybe some sort of residual sugar depending on the context, particularly when we're talking about spicy dishes, and the absence of oak. Those are wines that really, really bring that food friendliness and compatibility.
Well, thank you, Serafin. A lot of great information tonight. And signing off now, you can check the blog out at myfirstgrowth.com. I'd love to hear about the food and wine pairings you try out over the holiday season. So have a great holiday. I'll be back soon with another video.
Okay, happy holidays.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.